You've got plans, I've got plans. You've got ideas, I've got ideas. We have plans about how our life is going to go and what it should look like. But the question is, how do those plans come to pass? Is it by diligent hard work, 12-hour days, long shifts, breaking through barriers, being around the right people? Or is there a different process that we need to go through in order for these plans to be established? That is what today's episode is all about. Welcome to the Institute of Men podcast, formerly known as the Man I Want to Be podcast. My name is Keaton and I am your host. And today is Wisdom Wednesday, where the big idea is if you get wisdom, you get everything else. Today, we are going to be in Proverbs chapter 16. But before we get to that, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. If you're watching on YouTube, in the bottom right corner, you'll see a subscribe button. Bottom right corner of the video. Just click that button to subscribe to the channel. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or wherever you listen, be sure to hit subscribe so that you can always be up to date on content. Be sure if you were like, you want to go deeper into the community that we're trying to establish at the Institute of Men, you can check out our locals channel. All those links are down below. And occasionally I write on Substack if you prefer to read versus look at my face. All of those channels are available to you. I'll put them in the notes below, but be sure to subscribe to that YouTube. Proverbs chapter 16. We are talking about how do plans come to be established. And so today we're going to look at the wisdom, but we're also going to look at something that's very, very important when it comes to reading the Bible so that we can understand the Bible. In the Bible, a lot of times authors will use what are called either bookends or a framing structure so that you can understand what's happening in a passage of scripture. So for example, I'm going to have the verses down below. You'll see, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see them on the screen. In Matthew chapter 1, Matthew opens up his gospel. He does the genealogy, and you're like, why did you do that? But then it says this was to fulfill what was written by the prophet Isaiah. And he gives Emmanuel, which means God with us. You can see the scripture down below. And then Matthew 28, very last chapter of Matthew, the last thing Jesus says is, and behold, I will be with you to the end of the age. So you've got at the beginning, Emmanuel, God with us. At the very end, you've got Jesus saying, I will be with you. I'm going to heaven, but I will be with you. I will be with you. I will be with you. The Gospel of Matthew is framed by the promise that God would remain with his people. So everything in there is framed by those two things. This happens also on the Sermon on the Mount. I don't have these verses below, but it says at the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, if you practice these things, you will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. At the end, if it says, if you practice these things, you will be build your house upon the rock. The whole Sermon on the Mount is framed by practice these things. Don't just know these things. Practice these things. Be a man of action. What the authors are doing is they want to frame a passage of scripture so that you understand everything in the middle belongs to these two verses. Everything in the middle is supporting these 2 points. That's the same thing in Proverbs chapter 16. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 1, it says this, the plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. And then if you come down a little bit to verse 9, you're going to see that phrase similar. It doesn't always have to be exact. A lot of times it is exact, but it's going to be almost the same. Verse 9, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. So what you have here is there's plans in the heart of man. You've got plans, I've got plans. You've got ideas, I've got ideas. What you have here in these first 9 verses is a framing. How they're framed. You also have verse 1 and 2, verse 1 and 3, they're also framed. So, verse 1 in chapter 16, the plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. Verse 3, commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. So you've got a frame within a frame. If you've ever edited a video, you know you can have a frame within a frame. So that middle verse ties verse 1 and verse 3 together. In the middle verse there is, all the ways of man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit, or weighs the heart. What does that mean? That means that when you've got plans, you think they're perfect. You think they're going to be beneficial. They're going to change the world. They're going to be fruitful and beneficial and bring all the income you need for your family. They're going to be good. They're perfect. They're all pure. It's pure. There's no selfish motivation or conceit or selfish ambition. There's none of that. No. But the Lord, he knows your heart. He knows your heart. He knows if your work is committed to you or to him. He knows if your work and your plans and ideas are for your glory or for his. These are the steps. If you want your plans established, if you want to be successful, if you want to walk in the way of the Lord, if you want to do great things and have a great marriage and have a great career and all those things, there's one way to do it. You got to go through God's process, and God's process involves not outward appearance, but it involves your heart. It involves your character. He'd love to establish your plans, but if your plans get established at the cost of your heart, God's going to choose your heart every single time. That I can promise you. You can trust the process, submit to his process, and you will be established. You might find yourself with different plans than you initially set out with, but you will be established. That I can assure you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Institute of Man podcast. My name is Keaton. If you like what you heard, please subscribe on either your podcast app or YouTube. If you didn't like anything that I said, well, just pretend you didn't listen, because that helps us out too. And until next time, this is the Institute of Man podcast.